The desert had a way of listening even when no one spoke. Wind slid through the sage and sand like a slow breath, carrying the smell of iron and old smoke. Somewhere beyond the low hills, a hawk cried once and went quiet. That was when she said it, her voice thin but steady, as if she had already stepped halfway out of this world. "Just kill me fast." The words did not beg. They landed heavy, like a stone dropped into a dry well. She stood barefoot in the dust, dress torn and stained the color of rusted clay. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, not in shame, but in the tired way of someone who had looked at too much pain and found no reason left to lift her head. The men around her shifted their weight, hands tight on rifle stocks and knife handles. None of them spoke. They had seen fear before. This was something else. The Apache chief watched her from a few steps away. His face was cut from stone and weather, lined by sun and years of hard choices. He had buried sons. He had made war and made peace, then watched peace bleed out on the sand. He had learned that the world rarely offered clean answers. Still, something in the woman's voice had reached him, slipping past pride and custom, touching an old scar he never spoke of. She did not look like a spy or a soldier. She looked like someone the road had chewed up and left behind. Her wrists were raw where rope had rubbed them. Her lips were cracked. When the chief asked her where she came from, she only shook her head. When he asked who did this to her, her mouth tightened, and her eyes finally lifted. What he saw there made his chest feel heavy. Not fear, not hate. A warning. The desert sun burned down without mercy, but she shivered as if cold. "Do not send me back," she said. "If you cannot help me, then end it here." One of the younger warriors spat into the dust and turned away. Mercy was a dangerous thing. It could get a man killed. The chief raised his hand, and the camp went still. He stepped closer, slow and careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. He asked her to show him why she was so afraid. For a moment she hesitated. Then, with a small nod, she lifted the edge of her skirt just enough to reveal the mark burned into her skin. The air changed. It was not the sight of flesh that made the men draw back. It was the symbol itself, dark and cruel, pressed deep by fire, a sign known to those who lived by the gun and the dollar. It was the mark of men who did not forgive and did not forget. Men who bought land with blood and claimed people the same way they claimed cattle. A murmur ran through the camp. The chief's jaw tightened. He had seen that brand once before, years ago, on the body of a trader found dead near the river. That trader had been wrapped in chains and left for the buzzards. The soldiers who came after had not asked questions. They had only counted bodies. The woman let the skirt fall back into place. Her face showed no relief, only the same hard calm. "Now you know," she said. "They will follow. They always do." The chief turned away, his mind racing through old memories and fresh danger. The land was already tense. Settlers pushed west, driven by hunger and promises whispered by men who never touched the dirt. Soldiers followed, building forts like scars across the plains. Any spark could start a fire that would burn everything. He knew that helping her would mean trouble. He also knew that turning her away would not save them from it. The brand had already marked more than her skin. It had crossed an invisible line. As the sun slid lower, shadows stretched long and sharp. The chief ordered water brought to her and told her she would stay the night. Some of the warriors protested, their voices low but firm. He silenced them with a look. Leadership was not about pleasing everyone. It was about carrying the weight when no one else would. That night, the woman sat by the fire, wrapped in a borrowed blanket. She did not eat much. Flames danced in her eyes as she stared into them, seeing things no one else could. The chief sat across from her, listening to the night. Coyotes called in the distance. Somewhere far off, a rifle cracked, then went quiet. She spoke then, not looking at him. She spoke of a town built fast and rotten, of men who wore fine coats and smiled while signing papers that stole land and lives. She spoke of a place where screams were buried under laughter and music, where the brand was used to remind people who owned them. Her words were plain, but each one cut deep. When she finished, the fire had burned low. The chief fed it another stick and watched the sparks rise. He told her that the mark she carried would draw death like flies. He told her that if she stayed, his people would be in danger. She nodded, as if she had expected nothing else. "I know," she said. "That is why I asked you to be quick." The chief looked at her for a long time. He thought of treaties broken with a handshake and a smile. He thought of graves without names. He thought of how the world kept asking his people to disappear quietly. Finally, he spoke. "If they come," he said, "they will not take you without a fight." Her head turned toward him just slightly. Hope flickered, small and fragile. It scared her more than despair. "They are many," she said. "They have guns and papers and friends in high places." The chief nodded. "So do they," he said, meaning the land, the spirits, and the people who knew every stone and shadow. "And sometimes that is enough." Before dawn, a scout returned with news. Riders had been seen on the southern trail. Too many for a simple patrol. They rode hard, as if certain of their path. The brand had done its work. The camp stirred, tension thick as smoke. Weapons were checked. Children were moved deeper into the canyon. The woman stood at the edge of it all, watching men prepare to bleed for a choice she had brought with her. Guilt pressed down on her chest, but beneath it was something else, something dangerous. The chief walked to her side. In the growing light, the desert looked almost gentle. "You can still go," he said quietly. "If you leave now, they may follow you instead." She shook her head. "I have been running since the fire touched my skin," she said. "I am tired of leading death by the hand." The riders appeared as dark shapes against the morning sky. Dust rose around them, catching the sun. The chief lifted his chin, eyes hard and steady. He felt the old world holding its breath. Somewhere between the woman's whispered plea and the thunder of hooves, a line had been crossed. Whatever came next would change more than one life. And as the riders drew closer, their banners snapping in the wind, the chief wondered whether the brand had marked the beginning of an ending, or the start of a war that would finally demand its due. The riders slowed as they reached the outer rocks, spreading out the way men did when they expected trouble. Their horses were strong and well-fed, not the kind raised by wandering hands. Dust hung around them like a warning that refused to settle. The Apache chief watched without moving, his thoughts steady even as his pulse beat hard in his ears. He had seen this pattern before, men who believed the land already belonged to them because someone far away had written it so. The woman stood a short distance behind him, wrapped tight in the blanket. She could feel the ground trembling through her feet, each hoofbeat a reminder of what followed her wherever she went. Her mind drifted back to the place where the brand was burned into her skin, a place that called itself a town but felt more like a trap. It had risen fast along the trade route, built on timber promises and broken men. Folks there spoke of progress and law, but the law bent easily for those who paid in gold or fear. She had not always been running. Once, she had believed the talk of fresh starts and honest work. She had believed that the frontier rewarded courage. That belief lasted until she saw how quickly a person could be turned into property with a single mark and a piece of paper. The brand was not just pain. It was a message. It said you belong to us, even when you are far away. The chief knew parts of that world too, though from the other side of the fence. Traders came and went, some fair, many not. Soldiers marched through with flags and orders, leaving behind empty wells and tighter borders. Each year, the land felt smaller, like it was being folded in on itself. The brand the woman carried was a sign of that pressure, a symbol of men who believed they could press their will into flesh the same way they pressed fences into the earth. A warrior returned from the ridge and spoke low. The riders had a banner tied to a lance, A mark of authority meant to open doors and close mouths. It meant they would talk before they shot, but it also meant they expected to be obeyed. The chief gave a small nod. Words could be as sharp as blades. As the riders approached, one man pushed ahead of the rest. He sat tall, coat clean despite the dust, eyes cold and measuring. He called out, his voice carrying across the space between them, speaking of law and order, of a woman taken from rightful custody. He did not look at her when he spoke. He looked at the chief, as if daring him to disagree. The chief listened, face unreadable. He answered slowly, choosing each word like a stone placed carefully in a wall. He spoke of borders respected and guests protected. He spoke of how no one was owned by another under this sky. The man on the horse smiled thinly, as if amused by a child's stubbornness. While they spoke, the woman studied the riders, her memory picking out details. One had a scar she remembered, a pale line cutting through his beard. Another wore a ring she had seen flash in firelight back in that town. They had found her trail faster than she feared. That meant someone had talked. Or someone had planned this all along. The camp held its breath. Children were silent, their mothers' hands firm on their shoulders. The warriors stood ready but still, eyes fixed on the smallest movements. The desert watched too, wind tugging at clothing, dust crawling along the ground like something alive. The riders did not press closer. Not yet. They made their case, repeating it with small changes, like men used to wearing others down. The chief felt the familiar pull of time, the way waiting could either save lives or cost them. He thought of the old stories, of ancestors who faced similar moments when strangers came with smiles and papers. As the sun climbed, heat settled in. Sweat traced slow lines down backs and faces. The woman's thoughts wandered again, back to the night she escaped. Firelight. Laughter that turned sharp when she ran. The sound of hooves behind her. The promise shouted into the dark that she would be brought back. She had not believed then that she would make it this far. She had not believed she would stand before an Apache chief, her fate balanced on words spoken across open ground. The chief finally raised his hand, signaling a pause. He said that no one would be handed over without proof. Papers meant little here. The land remembered truth longer than ink. The lead rider's smile vanished. He leaned forward in his saddle, anger flashing through his calm. "You know what that mark means," the rider said, his voice lower now. "You know who stands behind it." The chief did know. He knew about the companies that hired guns and bought judges. He knew about the soldiers who arrived later to clean up what those men started. He also knew fear, and he knew how it could hollow a people out from the inside if given enough room. "I know what it has meant for many," the chief replied. "And I know what it has done." The rider's eyes flicked just once toward the woman. That was enough. The chief saw it. So did she. In that glance was ownership, anger, and something close to panic. Whatever the woman knew, it was more than a runaway story. The riders pulled back a short distance, forming a loose half-circle. They were deciding their next move. Force was an option, but a costly one. The chief felt the tension tighten like a drawn bowstring. He ordered no attack. Not yet. As the day wore on, a strange stillness settled. Birds kept their distance. Even the wind seemed cautious. The woman sat near the shade of a rock, listening to the low talk of the warriors nearby. She could feel their eyes on her, not unkind, but weighing the risk she carried with her. She wondered what would happen if she told them everything she knew, about the ledgers hidden under floorboards, about the names spoken behind closed doors, about how the brand was part of a larger plan to clear land fast without questions. She wondered if words could stop what was already moving. The chief approached her as the light began to soften. He asked her what she had seen, what she had heard. He did not push. He listened. She told him some things, holding others close, unsure who might need them later. With each truth, his face grew more serious. "These riders," he said quietly, are not the end of it." She nodded. "They never are." In the distance, one of the riders dismounted and knelt, touching the ground. A signal, old and simple. They were marking the place, claiming it in their way. The chief straightened, his shadow long on the sand. He felt the weight of generations behind him and the eyes of his people on his back. He knew the choices ahead would not be clean or easy. He also knew that turning away now would haunt them longer than any fight. As night crept closer, fires were lit on both sides, small points of light facing each other across the dark. The woman stared into the flames, her hand resting unconsciously over the place where the brand burned. Somewhere beyond the ring of firelight, plans were being made, lines drawn that could not be erased. The desert held its silence, waiting to see which promise would break first. Night settled fully, thick and heavy, pressing down on both camps like a held breath. The fires burned low, not from lack of wood, but from caution. Too much light made a target. Too little invited fear to wander. The Apache camp stayed quiet, voices kept low, movements measured. Across the open ground, the riders' camp gave off a different feeling. Laughter rose once, sharp and short, then cut off. It sounded forced, the kind used to hide nerves. The woman lay awake, staring up at the stars. They looked the same as they always had, scattered and distant, uncaring of brands and banners. She wondered how many nights she had spent looking at that same sky while believing things would somehow turn out right. Her body ached, but it was her thoughts that refused rest. Every sound made her tense, every shadow feel like a hand reaching for her. Not far away, the Apache chief sat with a few trusted warriors. They spoke in murmurs, planning without final decisions. He asked about the canyon paths, the water sources, the places where sound carried too easily. One warrior spoke of a narrow pass that could slow riders. Another warned of scouts moving farther out than before. The riders were careful. That made them dangerous. The chief thought about the brand again. Symbols carried power because people believed in them. That mark was meant to break will, to turn a person into a warning. But here it had done something else. It had brought two worlds into direct conflict without distance or delay. He wondered if the men who burned it knew what they had set in motion. Across the divide, the lead rider sat with his back to a rock, staring into his own fire. His men watched him, waiting. He felt the pressure from both sides. From behind, there were expectations, orders wrapped in polite words and sealed with promises of reward. From ahead, there was resistance he had not planned for. He did not like surprises, especially the kind that forced him to explain delays. He remembered the woman clearly. Not just her face, but the way she had listened when others talked. She had asked the wrong questions, noticed the wrong details. The brand was meant to silence her, to remind her of her place. Instead, she had run. That alone made her dangerous. People like her turned stories into proof. A scout slipped back into the riders' camp and spoke quietly. The Apache were not moving. No ambush. No retreat. Just waiting. The rider frowned. Waiting meant choice. Choice meant control slipping away. Before dawn, the woman rose and walked to the edge of the camp. She watched the faint line of light grow along the horizon. The desert changed colors slowly, like a bruise fading. She thought of the town again, of the people who looked the other way when the brand was pressed into her skin. Not all of them were cruel. Many were just afraid. Fear had built that place as much as greed. A young Apache woman approached her, offering a small cup of water. Their eyes met, and for a moment, no words were needed. Survival recognized survival. The woman with the brand drank and whispered thanks. She wondered how many lives like this had been caught between forces they never chose. As morning came, the riders shifted again, this time sending two men forward on foot, hands visible. A show of peace. The chief went to meet them, stopping well short of the space between camps. The woman stayed back, but she could hear raised voices carried by the open air. The riders spoke of compromise, of temporary arrangements, of keeping the woman under watch until higher authority could decide. The chief listened, then asked what would happen to her after. The riders did not answer directly. They did not need to. Everyone knew how that story ended. While the leaders talked, other things moved. A young Apache warrior slipped away, tasked with watching the outer trails. He had grown up hearing stories of raids and counter-raids, of how small signs could mean everything. He noticed broken brush that had not been there the night before. Someone else was nearby, unseen. Far to the west, a small group of settlers had stopped their wagons, uneasy. Smoke on the horizon and rumors carried by passing traders had made them pause. They argued among themselves, torn between fear and the need to keep moving. Conflict did not stay contained. It leaked outward, touching even those who tried to avoid it. Back in the camp, the woman felt a growing weight in her chest. She realized the riders were not just here for her. They were measuring the Apache, testing how far they could push without open fighting. She wondered if giving herself up would spare others. The thought twisted painfully inside her. She had spent so long fighting to stay alive. Now survival came with a cost she was not sure she could pay. She approached the chief again, her steps slow. She told him that the men chasing her were part of something larger, a network that reached into offices and forts. That if blood was spilled here, it would be used as an excuse, a story told to justify more violence. He listened, eyes steady, but she could see the strain beneath. "They will come no matter what," she said softly. "With or without a reason." The chief nodded. He had known that long before she arrived. Still, hearing it spoken made it heavier. He told her that his people had lived with reasons imposed on them for generations, that sometimes standing still was also a kind of resistance. The day stretched on, thick with heat and unspoken threats. The riders' camp grew restless. Horses stamped and snorted. One man cleaned his rifle over and over, though it was already spotless. The lead rider paced, glancing toward the Apache camp, then away, as if weighing a move he did not yet dare make. As afternoon faded, a messenger arrived from the north, breathless. He carried news of soldiers on the move, not close, but closer than before. The word spread quietly through the Apache camp. Faces tightened. This was how it always escalated. One presence justified another until the land was crowded with men who did not belong. The woman sat alone again, her fingers tracing patterns in the dust. She thought about the ledger she had seen, the names and marks that tied so many wrongs together. She had memorized more than she realized at the time. Numbers, routes, agreements whispered behind closed doors. Knowledge was another kind of brand, one that could not be burned away. Night fell once more heavier than the last. Fires burned again, mirrored across the open space. Somewhere, a horse whinnied sharply, then went quiet. The Apache scout returned with troubling news. More tracks. More eyes in the dark. The chief stood at the edge of the camp, looking out toward the riders' lights. He felt the moment tightening, like a storm building pressure before it breaks. Behind him were his people, their lives bound to his choices. Ahead was a force that did not know when to stop. The woman joined him, her blanket pulled close. Neither spoke. Words felt small now. The desert stretched out before them, ancient and patient, waiting to see which promise would be kept and which would be broken first. The third morning broke under a sky the color of pale ash, as if even the sun was unsure whether to rise fully. A thin wind moved through the camp, carrying the smell of dust and cold stone. People woke quietly, already alert, already tired in the way that comes before something finally gives way. The Apache chief stood before the fire pit, staring at the embers left from the night. He felt the moment pressing closer, the slow tightening that could no longer be ignored. Across the open ground, the riders were awake too. Their camp showed signs of impatience now. Horses were saddled earlier than before. Men spoke in sharper tones. The lead writer had sent another message at first light, this one stripped of polite words. It demanded the woman be handed over by sunset. No more talk, no more waiting. The message was carried by a man who looked uneasy, as if he already knew the answer. The chief listened without comment, then sent him back with nothing but silence. Silence, he knew, could speak louder than threats. The woman felt that silence settle over her like a weight. She moved through the camp, helping where she could, carrying water, tending a child's scraped knee. She wanted to leave something good behind, just in case. Faces followed her, not with blame, but with understanding. They knew this standoff was bigger than one person. Still, she was the spark that had lit it. A memory returned to her then, sharp and unwelcome. A man in a fine coat, leaning close as the brand heated, telling her this was for her own good. That order required sacrifice. That the frontier needed hard choices. She had not screamed. She had refused to give him that. The pain had nearly broken her anyway. She found the chief near the canyon edge, studying the land below. The drop was steep, the path narrow. A place where many things could go wrong, or right, depending on timing. She told him about the ledger again, about how it tied the writers to officials and soldiers. She said she believed proof still existed, hidden where even the men who made it felt safe. The chief listened, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Proof mattered in a world that pretended to care about law. It could slow the machines of power, sometimes even stop them. He asked where this proof might be. She told him, careful, quiet. A long way from here, but not unreachable. As the day grew warmer, tension crept into every movement. A pair of Apache scouts returned with grim news. More riders had been spotted to the south, staying just out of sight. The pressure was increasing, like hands closing around a throat. The riders were not alone anymore. The lead rider sensed it too. He rode forward again, this time alone, stopping at the same distance as before. He called out, his voice tight with controlled anger. He spoke of consequences, of how this choice would bring suffering. He claimed the woman was a criminal, a thief of information that did not belong to her. He spoke as if truth itself were property. The chief stepped forward to answer. He spoke calmly, reminding the rider that fear had been used as a weapon long enough. That the land remembered who bled on it, even if papers tried to forget. The rider laughed, but it sounded thin. He had expected resistance. He had not expected resolve. Behind the chief, the woman listened, her heart pounding. She realized then that this moment was no longer about saving herself. It was about what kind of frontier would survive. One ruled by brands and banners, or one shaped by people willing to stand their ground. The rider's eyes flicked past the chief again, toward the camp, toward her. He knew she was there. He knew time was slipping. He turned his horse sharply and rode back, dust kicking up behind him like smoke. The afternoon dragged. Shadows shortened, then lengthened again. The heat pressed down, making tempers brittle. In the Apache camp, elders gathered, speaking softly. Some argued for moving deeper into the canyon, buying time. Others warned that retreat would be seen as weakness. The chief listened to all of it, weighing every word. The woman sat with an older Apache woman who told her stories of past crossings, of times when survival meant patience instead of steel. She spoke of how happiness was not always loud or sudden. Sometimes it came quietly, after long nights of fear. The woman with the brand held on to those words, turning them over like stones in her pocket. As sunset approached, the riders began to move. They spread out, forming lines, not yet attacking, but showing intent. The sound of hooves rolled across the ground, steady and threatening. The Apache warriors took their positions, silent, ready. Children were moved farther back, out of sight. The camp changed shape, becoming something harder, more focused. The chief walked through his people, meeting eyes, offering small nods. He did not promise victory. He promised care. He promised that no choice would be made lightly. When he reached the woman, he paused. He told her that if things turned against them, there might be a chance to slip away through the canyon. She shook her head. "I have run enough," she said. "If there is a path forward, I want to help make it." Her words stayed with him as he returned to the front. The sky burned orange and red as the sun dipped low, turning dust into fire. The riders' leader raised his arm, signaling a halt. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold itself still. Then a new sound cut through the tension. Not hooves. Not shouting. A distant call carried by the wind. Another scout arrived, breathless, eyes wide. He brought news that changed the shape of the moment. Soldiers had been seen farther north, moving in an unexpected direction. Not toward the Apache camp, but toward the riders' supply line. The chief felt a flicker of something dangerous and hopeful. The world beyond this standoff was shifting too. Plans overlapped, alliances strained. Nothing was as clean as it appeared on paper. The riders reacted quickly. Their formation tightened. The lead rider shouted orders, his calm cracking. He had not planned for this angle. He had counted on isolation, on fear. Now time was working against him. The woman sensed it, the subtle change in the air. She stepped closer to the chief, her voice low. "If they lose control of the story," she said, "they will act fast. They will try to take me before anyone else arrives." The chief nodded. He could see it too. Desperation made men reckless. Reckless men made mistakes. The sun slipped lower, shadows stretching long and sharp. Fires were lit again, but this time they felt like signals rather than comfort. The riders' camp buzzed with movement. The Apache camp stayed still, coiled tight. In the distance, thunder rolled, though no clouds were visible. Or perhaps it was something else. The ground seemed to hum beneath their feet, alive with the weight of choices made and unmade. The woman closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the desert air. She thought of the brand, of how it had marked her as owned. She thought of how standing here, now it felt smaller than it ever had. Whatever came next would hurt, but it might also heal something long broken. The chief raised his hand, signaling readiness. Across the open ground, the lead rider did the same, his face set, jaw clenched. Between them lay dust, history, and a future that refused to be simple. As the last light slipped from the sky and night rushed in, both sides waited for the first move, knowing that once it came, there would be no turning back, only forward into whatever dawn decided to bring. Night broke open with motion instead of gunfire. The lead rider shouted an order that did not carry authority the way it once had. His men hesitated, glancing toward the dark north where trouble now waited for them. That pause was small, but it mattered. In moments like these, small things decided the shape of the future. The Apache chief did not raise a weapon. Instead, he stepped forward, his voice carrying calm into the chaos. He spoke loud enough for both camps to hear. He spoke of witnesses, of soldiers already questioning the riders' movements, of how stories traveled faster than bullets when fear began to crack. He spoke of the woman and what she carried in her memory, of ledgers and names that did not disappear just because a person did. The lead rider felt the ground shift under him, though he stayed in the saddle. He had built his power on silence and speed. Now both were slipping. He realized too late that this confrontation had drawn eyes he did not want watching. The frontier thrived on shadows. This place, tonight, had too much light. A sudden shout rose from the riders' camp. One of their men had broken ranks, pointing toward the north. Torches flickered there now, moving fast, organized. Soldiers, or at least men who looked like them. The rider swore under his breath. Retreat became the smarter choice, though pride fought it hard. He turned back to the Apache chief, rage and calculation wrestling in his eyes. "This is not finished," he said. The chief nodded once. Very few things ever are. The riders pulled back in uneven lines, tension snapping like dry wood. No shots were fired. No blades crossed. They faded into the darkness, taking their banners and threats with them. Dust settled slowly, as if unsure whether it was safe to rest. The Apache camp remained still long after the riders disappeared. No one cheered. Relief came quietly, like a careful guest. The woman felt her knees weaken, the strength she had been holding finally slipping away. She sat down hard on the ground, breath shaking. She was alive. More than that, she was not alone. As dawn came, pale and cautious, the camp stirred. Scouts returned with confirmation. The riders had retreated far, abandoning supplies to move faster. Soldiers had indeed cut across their trail, asking questions that could not be easily answered. The lead rider's network had been exposed, if not destroyed. That alone changed everything. The chief called a gathering. He spoke to his people, not as a victor, but as a keeper of balance. He said danger still existed, but it had been pushed back for now. He said they would move camp soon, not in fear, but in wisdom. The land offered many paths to those who respected it. He then turned to the woman. All eyes followed. She felt suddenly seen in a way that made her chest ache. The chief asked her what she wished to do next. The question was simple, but it carried weight. Choice had been stolen from her for so long that it felt strange to hold it again. She spoke slowly, choosing honesty over certainty. She said she wanted to see the proof brought into the open. She wanted the stories told, not whispered. She wanted a place where the brand on her skin did not define her ending. She did not know exactly where that place was yet. The chief listened. He told her there were traitors he trusted, people who still believed in fairness more than profit. He said he would send word along routes that did not bend easily. He said truth moved slower than violence, but it lasted longer. In the days that followed, the camp shifted. Tents were packed. Fires were put out carefully. Life resumed its steady rhythm, changed but not broken. The woman traveled with them for a time, learning the quiet strength of people who had endured worse and kept going anyway. She helped where she could, listened more than she spoke. Children laughed again, testing the safety of the world. Elders told stories by the fire, reminding everyone that survival was not just about fighting, but about remembering who you were. One evening, as the sky burned gold and purple, the chief sat with the woman near a stream. He asked her if she regretted not running when she had the chance. She thought about it, then shook her head. Running had kept her alive. Staying had given her something else. They wanted me to disappear, she said. Instead, I stood where they could see me. The chief nodded. That is how many things begin to change. When the time came for her to leave, it was quiet and without ceremony. A small group would travel with her part of the way, ensuring she reached safer ground. She carried no weapons, but she carried knowledge and the confidence that came from being believed. Before she left, the Apache women gave her new clothes, sewn strong and plain. The brand on her skin remained, but it felt different now. Less like a claim. More like a scar that proved survival. As she walked away from the camp, she looked back once. The chief stood watching, a steady figure against the land. She raised her hand. He returned the gesture, small but sure. The frontier did not change overnight. It never did. But somewhere along the trade routes, stories began to shift. Questions were asked. Papers were examined more closely. Men who relied on silence found it harder to keep. The woman continued on, her path uncertain but her steps firm. She would speak when needed. She would rest when she could. Happiness, she learned, was not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. Behind her, the desert stretched wide and patient, holding the memory of a night when fear did not win. Ahead of her lay a world still rough and unfair, but no longer impossible. And in that balance between what was lost and what remained, a new kind of freedom took root, quiet and enduring under the same wide sky that had watched it all.